Hello everyone. So we're back with Dolphin Song by Lawrence and John. It's got really exciting. Last read was actually 2 chapters, so we're now on chapter 12. And Martine and Ben, her friend, have survived an incredible ordeal. Martine woke to the soothing swish of sea and the sun on her skin. It flowed into her grateful bones like hot honey. She tried opening her eyes, but her lashes were crusty with dried salt, and at first all she saw was a beach strewn with untidy heaps of clothes and a few life jackets. Then one of the heaps started snoring. Claudius! Martine couldn't believe it. As if she hadn't been through enough. What had she done in her life to deserve being stuck on a desert island with Claudius? Further down the beach, Sherilyn was lying on her back wearing pink pajamas. Her mouth was open. Her fluffy polka-dotted dressing gown was gone. On her left was Jake Emery. His lanky athletic limbs curled into a fetal ball, and on the other side was Lucy van Heerden. Her pale blonde hair splayed over the sand. A large orange crab was making a home in it. Martine debated whether to remove it, but couldn't summon up the energy. Further along the beach lay the sprawled figure of an African boy. Martine's eyes wouldn't cooperate enough for her to be sure, but it looked like Nathan Niati. He too appeared to be asleep. Her gaze shifted to the last item of clothing, and she saw that was all it was, an item of clothing. Ben. Where was Ben? Some of the terror of the previous night returned to rob Martine of what little reserve she had. She scrambled to her feet and stood rocking, her head swimming. The beach felt as unsteady as the deck of a yacht. Gradually the dizziness passed, and she took a few steps, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Her lips, too, were cracked and swollen. She had a raging thirst. Her jeans and top were still damp on the side where she'd slept on them, and her hair was matted with gritty sand. Her stomach growled loudly. She longed for a shower, a coffee, and 2 or 3 of Alberto's bacon and fried banana rolls. But those were clearly out of the question. Ben! She had to find Ben. She began to walk along the beach, and it was only then that her mind unfogged sufficiently for her to take in her surroundings. The sand stretching out before her was of the purest white, though the early morning sunlight gave it a rose glow. It was so clean that it squeaked underfoot as if mice or a litter of puppies were nestling beneath it. Palm trees followed the long, lazy curve of the bay. The turquoise sea was as translucent as bathwater. Martine could see a big blue starfish drifting along the bottom of it. In the distance she could hear the dull crashing of waves. But the water in the bay was tranquil and idyllic, suggesting it was ringed by a coral reef. But it was the island itself that really got Martine's attention. It didn't look like the sort of island one saw in photographs of Mauritius or the Caribbean. It was a mix of mountainous sand dunes, regular African bush, and lush, low-lying greenery, as though the deserts of Arabia had been joined up with Sorbonne. A lighthouse was perched on the highest point. There were no obvious signs of human habitation, but the lighthouse was very encouraging. Martine had a dim recollection of coming round briefly at some point during the night and seeing a yellow beam flashing from its tower. If there was a lighthouse with a working light, surely that meant there was a lighthouse keeper. Martine reached the end of the beach without seeing any sign of Ben. She was staring up at the Everest of rippled chestnut sand, trying to pluck up the courage to return to her fellow castaways and appeal to them to form a search party, when he came tripping over the top of the dune. His black hair was wet and shiny, and he was wearing frayed denim shorts, which he'd manufactured somewhat haphazardly from his jeans. Shirtless, he looked slimmer than ever, but his arms were strong, and his chest and stomach were ridged with muscle. With his burnt caramel skin, he looked as if he belonged to the island, as if it was his natural home. Breakfast, he called to Martine when he saw her, dipping his chin at the stack of green coconuts he was holding in his arms. He slid the rest of the way down the dune and dropped them at her feet. Only one small problem: I haven't been able to find a way to remove their outer husks. They're very tough and fibrous, and bashing them against rocks barely makes an impression. Martine was so taken aback by the sight of him, particularly since he looked and spoke like a boy on his summer holidays and not like the survivor of a harrowing ordeal, that she was silenced. A concerned frown came over Ben's face, and he had to ask her twice if she was okay before she managed to get out. "I have a knife. Maybe we can use the knife to cut off the husks." Then it was Ben's turn to look astonished as he realized that not only was she still wearing her pouch, it was a survival kit. He watched wide-eyed as she turned out the contents for him to see, showing him the matches, Swiss Army knife, fishing line, compass, and Grace's potions. Everything had stayed clean and dry in the waterproof pouch, but the leaves were badly wilted. Their days were numbered. Again, Ben couldn't believe she had carried them all the way from Cape Town. Are they important? We might be able to save them. What are we going to save them with? Coconut milk? Ben laughed. He'd cut the husk off the first coconut, and now he pierced 3 little holes in the top of it and handed it to Martine. "Drink this and I'll show you." Martine had never appreciated any liquid more, although it wasn't as coconutty as she was expecting and was really quite sour tasting and fermented. Still, it was wonderfully soothing to her cracked lips and parched throat. When she was done, she broke the brown bristled shell against a rock. The moist coconut meat inside was sweet and Moorish. With every mouthful, she could feel the energy returning to her limbs. Ben nibbled at his while he worked at dehusking the remaining coconuts. Martine watched, wondering how he'd managed to scrub up so well in the sea. She felt very self-conscious beside him. Her salt-stiffened hair was sticking up like a punk rocker's mohawk, and she was quite certain she smelled like a day-old haddock. She was very relieved when Ben put the coconuts in the shade and said that he had something to show her. She followed him up the high dune with difficulty, the soft sand sinking like snow beneath her feet, her muscles protesting. Over the other side, the ground was firmer. Ben led her through palm groves and trees draped with tropical creepers, walking with an enthusiasm she was far from sharing. She plodded behind him, feeling breathless. Her head hurt. Colourful birds skittered through the leaves, but Martine barely noticed them. She was remembering what Alberta had told her about all the snakes on the Mozambican islands. "Ben, I don't understand why you're so cheerful." She was unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. "We nearly died last night, and now we're marooned on an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's a disaster, and you're acting like we're on vacation or something." "I'm not happy because we nearly died last night. I'm happy because we're alive this morning," Ben explained. "I'm happy because the dolphins saved us, which is sort of a miracle, and because we've already found 2 of the things we're going to need to survive. Obviously, I'd rather be eating breakfast on the sea kestrel, but whatever happens now, it'll be an adventure, a real adventure." "You said we found 2 of the things we need to survive." "We found food. What's the other thing?" They'd reached the edge of the trees. Ben stepped aside. Before them, fringed with reeds, was a small lake. "This," he said. "Is that really?" Martine was reluctant to put what she saw into words in case it too turned out to be a mirage. "Clean water?" "Well, no, not exactly, but it is fresh water. Just to be on the safe side, use the bandana to strain it into one of the gourds from that monkey apple tree before you drink it, but I'd say it's pretty pure. It's definitely pure enough to bathe in. You'll need to be careful, though. Mozambique has lots of freshwater crocodiles, and this kind of habitat is perfect for them." Martine, who'd been so eager for a drink and a bath that she'd been poised to leap into the shallows, fully clothed, decided that cleanliness was not a priority after all. She'd had enough problems with sharks. She didn't need new nightmares about crocodiles. "Maybe I've had enough of being in the water for the time being," she began. She stopped. Ben was holding his nose. "Okay, I take the hint," she said crossly, "but if I get attacked by a crocodile, you're going to have to answer to my grandmother." As soon as the words were out, it hit her that she'd been so preoccupied with searching for Ben and thinking about how hungry she was and how much her head hurt, she hadn't taken in that there was no guarantee that she would see her grandmother or her beloved white giraffe ever again. It was heartbreaking to realize that her grandmother's last memory of her might be of their fight, and that Jimmy would never understand that something had happened to prevent her returning to him. He'd think she'd abandoned him. Ben saw the anguish on her face, and his own sobered. Listen, if there's a way off this island, we'll find it, I promise. You will see your grandmother and Jemmy again, and I will see my mum and dad, but I have a feeling that the dolphins have brought us here for a reason. It's up to us to figure out what that reason might be. Right, how are Martine and Ben going to get on the island?